The first light of the high-ridge dawn filtered through the frost-rimed windowpane of the workshop, a pale and thin illumination that caught the swirling dust motes suspended in the chill air. Silas stirred beneath the heavy wool blankets, his body moving with a slow and deliberate ache that spoke of the previous day's labor and the ritual of the freezing mountain air. The workshop was silent save for the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the wind pressing against the cedar shingles outside, a sound that felt like the very breath of the mountain itself. He rose with a quiet grunt, his bare feet meeting the cold timber of the floorboards with a dull thud creak that echoed in the stillness. The air in the room was sharp, carrying the lingering scent of resinous pine and the metallic, almost sweet tang of the yew dust that had settled into every crevice despite the protective mask. He moved toward the hearth, his hands calloused and steady as he cleared the white ash from the embers of the previous night's fire. With a patient precision, he laid thin slivers of dry kindling in a crosshatched pattern, the wood clicking together like bone, before blowing gently until a small orange glow flickered into life. The heat began to radiate outward, a slow blooming warmth that fought against the 2 degrees Celsius temperature of the room. Silas stood and turned his gaze toward the workbench where the yew crozier lay, a dark and elegant silhouette against the gray morning light. The anchor ritual had been successful. The extreme cold of the high ridge had case-hardened the finish, locking the oils and the burnished wood into a surface that felt less like timber and more like polished stone. He approached the bench, his movements fluid and rhythmic, and reached out to touch the wood. His fingers traced the curve of the shepherd's crook, the ancient yew yielding a sensation of immense density and age. The surface was smooth, a tactile screehush sound as his palms slid along the length of the staff. He could feel the history of the 300-year-old slab beneath his skin, the tight growth rings representing centuries of slow, patient survival in the elements. The 7 stones burnishing had left a deep, translucent luster that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it. Silas picked up the crozier, its weight balanced perfectly in his hand, the center of gravity falling exactly where he had intended during the initial rough-out. The bog oak finial at the base was cool to the touch, providing a grounding weight that anchored the lighter, more flexible yew. He moved the staff through the air, listening to the faint whistle it made, a low-pitched hum that signaled its structural integrity. There were no cracks, no checks from the rapid cooling of the anchor ritual. The wood had held. He set the crozier back down on the felt pads of the workbench and moved to the small kitchenette in the corner of the workshop. The sound of water pouring into the iron kettle was a hollow splash gurgle, followed by the heavy clink of the kettle meeting the stovetop. As the water began to heat, Silas retrieved a small tin of beeswax and a clean linen cloth. He sat on his stool, his back straight and his eyes fixed on the work ahead. The decision of the crozier's future weighed on him with a quiet gravity. It was a vessel of authority for St. Jude's Abbey, a tool for the abbot to guide his flock, yet it had been born here, in the solitude of the high ridge, among the tools that Silas considered his only true companions. He began to apply a final, sacrificial layer of wax to the wood, the cloth moving in small, tight circles that produced the rhythmic shush, hic, shush, hic, against the grain. The scent of the honeyed wax mingled with the wood smoke from the hearth, creating a sensory layer of protection and completion. He thought of the abbot and the journey back through the mountain pass. The storm had passed, leaving a world of brilliant, blinding white outside the door, but the path would be treacherous and the snow deep. He would need to wrap the crozier in oilcloth and bind it to his pack with leather thongs to ensure no moisture touched the finished surface until it had reached the controlled environment of the abbey's scriptorium. The kettle began to whistle, a rising note that pierced the meditative silence of the room. Silas rose and prepared a simple tea, the steam rising in white plumes that vanished into the rafters. He drank slowly, the heat spreading through his chest, his mind moving through the technical requirements of the return journey. He would need to check the tension on his snowshoes and ensure his heavy furs were dry. The woodcarver spoke little, even to himself, but his actions were a dialogue with the material world. Every movement was a calculation of force and resistance, a testament to a lifetime of working with the grain rather than against it. He looked again at the crozier, the deep amber of the yew glowing in the strengthening light of the sun. It was finished, but the ritual of its delivery was just beginning. He set the empty cup down and reached for a length of thick canvas, beginning the process of swaddling the staff for transit. The fabric made a heavy, muffled rustle flap as he folded it over the crook, securing it with hemp cord that bit into the cloth with a satisfying snap tug. He worked with a deliberate slowness, ensuring every inch of the ancient wood was shielded from the biting wind and the abrasive snow. This was the transition from creator to messenger, a role he accepted with the same stoicism he applied to the chisel. The workshop, usually a place of transformation, was now a staging ground for departure. He checked his tools one last time, the shush, hick, of the whetstone as he gave his favorite pocket knife a final edge, the sound sharp and clean in the cold air. The morning was advancing, and the high ridge beckoned with its silent, frozen beauty. Silas shouldered his pack, the weight familiar and grounding, and felt the presence of the wrapped crozier against his spine. He stepped toward the heavy oak door, his hand resting on the iron latch for a moment of stillness. The world outside was a vast expanse of light and shadow, a landscape that required the same respect and patience as a piece of seasoned timber. He pressed down on the latch, the metallic clack signaling the end of his seclusion, and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the mountain morning, the snow crunching under his boots with a rhythmic, steady beat that marked the beginning of the long descent. The heavy oak door of the workshop groaned on its iron hinges, a sound like a low-pitched cello note that vibrated through Silas's boots as he pulled it shut against the biting mountain air. He turned the iron key in the lock, the metallic clack snick echoing sharply against the frozen stone of the threshold, signaling the formal end of his creative isolation. He stood for a moment, the weight of his pack settling against his shoulders, the wrapped yew crozier a steady, unyielding presence against his spine. The air outside was a physical weight, a cold so pure it felt crystalline as it filled his lungs, tasting of ozone and ancient ice. The temperature had dropped to -6 degrees, and the sun, though bright, offered a pale, heatless light that turned the snow-covered high ridge into a landscape of blinding diamonds and deep, indigo shadows. Silas reached down to adjust the leather thongs of his snowshoes, his fingers stiffening slightly in the cold but remaining precise. The rawhide bindings made a rhythmic crick snap as he tightened them, ensuring the ashwood frames were secured to his heavy fur-lined boots. He tested the tension with a firm tug-pull, satisfied with the mechanical integrity of his gear. Every piece of equipment he carried was a product of his own hands or a trade with a master of a different craft, a network of utility that mirrored the root systems of the pines below. He took his first step, the snowshoe breaking the surface crust with a satisfying scree-hush, followed by the muffled thud of his weight settling into the powder. The rhythm of the descent began. One step, breath, another step, breath. He used a long staff of seasoned ash to steady his gait, the metal-tipped end clicking against buried stones with a sharp tock-tock that served as a sonar for the terrain beneath the white blanket. As he moved away from the workshop, the structure seemed to shrink against the vastness of the ridge, its cedar shingles gray and weathered, a solitary outpost of human intent in a wilderness of elemental force. The path down from the high ridge was a series of narrow switchbacks, carved into the granite face of the mountain by generations of seekers and woodsmen. Silas navigated these with a focused intentionality, his eyes scanning the snow for signs of instability or hidden ice. He could feel the momentum of the descent wanting to pull him faster, a gravitational tug that he resisted with the steady placement of his ash staff. The sound of his movement was a constant, meditative loop, the scree-hush of the snowshoes, the talk of the staff, the rhythmic huff-puff of his breath blooming in white plumes before the wind swept them away. The scent of the air changed as he lost elevation, moving from the thin, sharp scent of the heights toward the richer, resinous perfume of the timberline. The deep pines loomed ahead, a dark green wall of ancient sentinels that had stood since before the abbey was a foundation stone. Their branches were heavy with the weight of the recent storm, bowing low like mourners in a silent procession. As he entered the first stand of trees, the wind died down, replaced by a profound, muffled silence that only the deep woods can provide. The temperature seemed to rise by a fraction of a degree, sheltered by the dense canopy, but the dampness increased, a cold that seeped into the bones rather than biting the skin. Silas paused for a moment beneath a massive white pine, its trunk so wide he could not have reached around it. He looked up, watching the way the needles filtered the light into long, golden spears that pierced the gloom of the forest floor. A sudden whump thud sounded nearby as a bough, unable to bear its burden any longer, shed a thick slab of snow. The sound was heavy and visceral, a reminder of the shifting weight of the world. Silas adjusted his pack, the canvas wrapping of the crozier rustling with the dry, papery sound against his coat. He thought of the wood inside, the ancient yew that had once been a part of a forest like this, though far older and more storied. The wood was now a vessel, its purpose transformed through the ritual of the knife and the stone, yet it remained tethered to the earth. He continued his trek, the ground leveling out as he moved deeper into the heart of the pines. The trail here was less defined, a winding ribbon of white between the massive, furrowed trunks of the trees. He moved with the grace of a man who knew the language of the forest, avoiding the soft wells of snow around the base of the trees and seeking the firmer ground of the open clearings. The sounds of the forest began to reveal themselves to his attuned ears. The distant, rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker, a rapid-fire tap-tap-tap that sounded like a small hammer against a hollow log. The soft, whistling sigh of the wind in the high branches, a sound the mountain folk called the singing of the needles. The occasional skitter of a squirrel, or the heavy, plodding movement of a deer hidden in the thicket. Silas processed these sounds as technical data, a map of the living world that surrounded him. He reached a frozen stream, the water locked beneath a thick, translucent layer of ice that glowed with a faint cerulean light. He could hear the water moving underneath, a low-frequency gurgle chime that pulsed like a heartbeat. He crossed carefully, his snowshoes distributing his weight across the fragile bridge, the ice groaning with a deep, resonant creak snap that vibrated through his legs. He did not rush. The philosophy of the woodcarver was one of patient progression, whether at the workbench or on the trail. He reached a landmark he knew well, a massive outcropping of granite known as the Weeping Rock. In the summer, water trickled down its face in a constant, gentle weep, but now it was a frozen monument, draped in massive icicles that looked like the pipes of a great cathedral organ. The ice was clear and jagged, catching the stray rays of sunlight and refracting them into prisms of color across the snow. Silas leaned against the rock, the cold of the stone penetrating through his furs, providing a grounding sensation of solidity. He took a small flask from his coat and took a sip of water, the liquid cold and clean, tasting faintly of the cedar vessel it was stored in. He looked down at his hands, the skin mapped with lines of labor and scars from slips of the chisel. They were the tools that had shaped the crozier, the interface between his mind and the ancient wood. He felt a sense of completion, a quiet satisfaction that did not need words. The descent was half over. The abbey lay in the valley below, a cluster of stone buildings nestled in the embrace of the lower hills. He could not see it yet, but he could feel its presence, a destination that required him to relinquish his creation. The walk was a transition, a slow peeling away of the intimacy he had shared with the yew over the past weeks. He would deliver the staff, and it would belong to the abbot, to the rituals of the church, and eventually to history. He pushed off from the Weeping Rock, his boots finding the rhythm once more. The terrain began to change again, the pines giving way to stands of birch and maple, their skeletal branches reaching up like silver fingers against the darkening blue of the sky. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the snow in long, distorted shapes. Silas moved with a steady, unflagging pace, his body a machine of bone and muscle tuned to the requirements of the mountain. He focused on the mechanical sensation of the snowshoe bindings, the way they flexed and held with every step. He thought of the physics of the lever and the fulcrum, the way his ash staff provided a third point of contact that stabilized his entire frame. The world was a series of interconnected forces, and his role was to navigate them with respect and skill. The air grew thicker as he descended, the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths beginning to drift on the cooling breeze. It was a domestic scent, a smell of home and warmth that contrasted with the wild, ozonic purity of the high ridge. Silas did not yearn for the warmth yet. He inhabited the cold with a stoic acceptance, finding a form of rest in the very act of movement. This was active rest, the engagement of the senses and the body in a task that allowed the mind to settle into a deep, rhythmic stillness. He was a part of the landscape, a moving element in a frozen tableau. He reached the edge of the deep pines, where the forest opened up into the rolling meadows that bordered the abbey lands. The snow here was windswept and packed hard, allowing him to move with greater speed. The tock-tock of his staff became more frequent, a faster tempo that signaled the nearing end of the journey. He could see the first of the abbey's stone walls in the distance, a gray line against the white expanse. The sun was dipping below the horizon now, casting a final, fiery glow across the peaks of the high ridge, turning the snow to a soft, bruised purple. Silas felt the temperature drop sharply as the light faded, the frost beginning to form on the edges of his hood and in the thick hair of his beard. He did not quicken his pace. He maintained the same deliberate, rhythmic stride, honoring the distance and the effort. He crossed the final ridge, the Abbey of St. Jude appearing in full view, its windows beginning to flicker with the warm, yellow light of candles and oil lamps. The sound of a distant bell began to toll, a deep, resonant bronze note that rolled across the valley in waves of sound. It was the call to vespers, a signal of order and ritual that greeted the woodcarver as he emerged from the wild. Silas adjusted the strap of his pack one last time, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the Yew Crozier. He had brought it through the storm, through the ritual of the stones and the cold, and now through the heart of the deep pines. He walked toward the great oak gates of the abbey, the snow crunching under his feet in the final, steady beat that echoed the tolling of the bell. The transition was almost complete, the Creator approaching the threshold of the world he served. He reached the gate and raised his hand to the heavy iron knocker, the metal cold and unyielding against his palm. The sound of the knock was a single, authoritative thud that announced his arrival, a period at the end of a long and difficult sentence. He stood and waited, his breath a steady cloud in the twilight, his eyes fixed on the wood of the gate, noticing the grain and the joinery even now, in the moment of his return. The gate began to creak open, a sliver of warm light spilling out onto the snow, and Silas stepped forward, the weight of the forest and the mountains still clinging to his coat like a shroud of frost. He moved into the courtyard, the sound of his snowshoes on the cobblestones a new and jarring note in the symphony of his journey. The brothers were moving toward the chapel, their cowls pulled low, their movements silent and ghost-like in the dim light. Silas found the familiar path to the abbot's quarters, his steps sure even in the deepening gloom. He reached the door and paused, taking a final moment to feel the presence of the crozier on his back before he would unwrap it and reveal its beauty to the man who had commissioned it. The journey was not just a physical passage, it was the final stage of the carving itself, a seasoning of the spirit that matched the seasoning of the wood. He knocked gently on the abbot's door, the sound muffled and soft, a gesture of respect for the silence of the place. The door opened, and the scent of old parchment and beeswax candles wafted out, a sensory overlap with his own workshop that felt like a bridge between two worlds. Silas stepped inside, the heat of the room a sudden and overwhelming force that made his skin tingle and his lungs expand. He moved to the large oak table in the center of the room and began to unbuckle his pack, his movements slow and reverent. He laid the wrapped bundle on the table, the canvas dark with the moisture of the descent. With steady hands, he began to undo the hemp cords, the sound of the knots yielding a series of soft clicks and snaps. He folded back the layers of oilcloth and canvas, revealing the dark, lustrous surface of the ancient yew. The light from the candles caught the finish, the 7 stones burnished glowing with a depth that seemed to pull the gaze into the very heart of the wood. The abbot approached, his face a map of age and contemplation, his eyes widening as he looked upon the work. Silas stood back, his arms crossed over his chest, his role as the storyteller of the wood complete for this moment. The crozier lay there, a masterpiece of form and function, a bridge between the wild energy of the high ridge and the structured devotion of the abbey. The room was silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the slow, deep breathing of the 2 men. Silas felt the fatigue of the journey begin to settle into his muscles, a heavy and welcome sensation that signaled the onset of a different kind of rest. He had fulfilled his vow to the wood and to the man, and the weight he had carried was now shared with the world. He looked at the abbot, seeing the reflection of the candles in the polished surface of the yew, a flicker of light that seemed to animate the ancient timber. The work was done, yet the story of the crozier was only just beginning its life in the hands of the faithful. Silas reached out and touched the bog oak finial one last time, a silent goodbye to the object that had occupied his mind and hands for so many days. The wood was cold, holding the memory of the mountain air, a reminder of the origins of all things. He turned toward the fire, the warmth drawing him in, a physical reward for the trials of the descent. The shadows danced on the walls, shapes of trees and tools and memories of the path he had taken. He was the woodcarver, rooted and patient, a man who understood that every finish was also a beginning. The abbot nodded in a slow, rhythmic motion, his eyes never leaving the deep, translucent luster of the ancient yew as he gestured toward the small stone hearth where the fire crackled with a low rumhush that echoed in the quiet room. Silas felt the tension in his shoulders begin to dissipate, a heavy, sinking feeling that was both a burden and a relief as he moved toward the guest quarters provided for him in the north wing of the cloister. The transition from the frozen, crystalline air of the high ridge to the thick, incense-heavy atmosphere of the abbey was a physical weight, a shift in pressure that made his ears pop with a soft clack-click sensation. He walked down the long, vaulted corridor, his heavy boots making a muffled thud-talk against the ancient flagstones which had been worn smooth by centuries of monastic life. The stone walls were cool to the touch, weeping a slight moisture that smelled of minerals and thyme, a stark contrast to the resinous, dry scent of his timber workshop. He reached the guest cell, a modest room with a high, narrow window that looked out toward the dark silhouette of the deep pines, and closed the heavy oak door with a resonant thump, shush that sealed out the world. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow cot with a straw mattress, a small wooden stool, and a wash basin made of hammered copper that caught the flickering light of a single tallow candle. Silas set his pack down on the floor, the frame making a weary creak groan as the weight was finally released from his spine. He stood still for a long moment, letting his body calibrate to the lack of movement, the ghost weight of the yew crozier still pressing against his mind. He began the ritual of the tools, a task that was as much about his own mental transition as it was about the maintenance of his equipment. He sat on a low stool, his back straight despite the fatigue, and reached into his pack for his primary carving knives and the small whetstone he carried in a leather slit. The moisture from the descent had to be addressed immediately to prevent the steel from pitting. He took a clean rag, infused with a blend of mineral oil and beeswax, and began to wipe down the blade of his favorite straight-edge chisel. The sound was a rhythmic, elongated shush, hic that filled the small cell, a familiar frequency that acted as a tether to his identity as a maker. Shush, hic. He repeated the motion with a mechanical precision, his eyes focused on the way the oil moved across the polished metal, creating a protective barrier against the humid abbey air. He then moved the blade across the whetstone, the angle held at a perfect 25 degrees by the muscle memory of 40 years. The sound shifted to a sharper screechoo, a metallic whisper that signaled the refinement of the edge. He checked the sharpness with the pad of his thumb, a light, glancing pressure that revealed a hair-splitting keenness, the sensation a tiny tick of feedback against his skin. After the tools were cleaned and stowed in their rolls, he turned his attention to his own physical state. He moved to the copper wash basin and poured water from a ceramic pitcher, the liquid making a hollow glug splash that echoed in the stone cell. The water was cool, not the freezing temperature of the mountain runoff, but a tempered, cellar cool that felt like silk against his calloused hands. He washed the mountain grime from his face, the scent of the soap, a simple lye and lavender blend, striking him as incredibly domestic and soft. He dried himself with a coarse linen towel, the fabric making a scrub-hush sound against his beard. A brother appeared at the door, silent as a shadow, and left a wooden tray containing a bowl of thick barley pottage, a heel of dark rye bread, and a small mug of weak ale. Silas ate with a deliberate slowness, the wooden spoon making a rhythmic clack-clink against the side of the bowl. The pottage was warm and earthy, the heat spreading through his core and loosening the last of the mountain's grip on his muscles. The rye bread was dense and chewy, requiring a slow, methodical mastication that felt like another form of labor. He finished the meal and set the tray aside, his movements becoming increasingly heavy as the lack of adrenaline began to take its toll. The temperature in the cell was a stable 18 degrees Celsius, a luxury compared to the negative 6 degrees Celsius of the ridge. He stood and moved to the narrow window, looking out at the stars that were beginning to pierce the velvet dark of the valley. The deep pines were a black ocean below, a vast and silent kingdom that he would have to traverse again in the coming days. For now, however, the requirements of the wood had been met. The crozier was safe in the hands of the abbot, and the responsibility of its form no longer rested on Silas's shoulders. He moved to the cot, the straw mattress rustling with a dry crinkle crunch as he sat down to remove his boots. The leather was stiff with salt and moisture, the laces making a sharp snap tug as he loosened the knots. He set them neatly by the door, the heels meeting the stone with a final, grounding thud. He lay back, the weight of his body sinking into the straw, the texture of the mattress making a constant, low-level hushed crinkle that served as a white noise backdrop to his thoughts. The ceiling of the cell was high and arched, the shadows of the candle flame dancing across the stone in slow, hypnotic patterns. Silas felt his breathing deepen, the rhythm slowing to a steady, oceanic pulse. The sounds of the abbey, the distant chime of a bell, the shuffle of sandaled feet in the corridor, the sigh of the wind through the high vents, blended into a single, cohesive drone. His mind drifted back to the yew, the way the grain had fought and then yielded, the way the 7 stones had brought forth the inner light of the timber. He could almost feel the phantom sensation of the wood beneath his fingers, the shush, hick of the final burnish. The fatigue was a warm tide now, rising from his feet to his chest, pulling him down into the soft, dark earth of unconsciousness. He did not fight it. He was a man who understood the necessity of the fallow season, the importance of the pause between the strike of the hammer and the cooling of the steel. The workshop on the high ridge was a world away, a memory of cold and focus that would wait for his return. Here, in the heart of the stone silence, there was only the slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of his lungs. The candle flickered one last time, a tiny spit pop of hot wax, before the wick drowned and the room was plunged into a perfect, velvety blackness. The air was still, holding the faint scent of the rye bread and the lavender soap. Silas closed his eyes, his consciousness narrowing to a single, fading point of light. And in that quietude he slept,